My name's Derek Slater, and I'm really thrilled to welcome you here to an Authors at Google Talk with Virginia Postrel. She's an author, columnist, and speaker whose work spans a broad range of topics, from social science to fashion, concentrating on the intersection of culture, commerce, and technology. And we're here to talk about her latest book, The Fabric of Civilization: How Textiles Made the World, which examines the development of technology, industry, and commerce through the history of textiles, from prehistoric times to now and into the near future. And I'm really thrilled to welcome Virginia here because she has a unique ability to tackle such sweeping, complex, and intersecting subjects, and has really been essential reading for anyone exploring matters of technology and society. For instance, over 2 decades ago, she wrote this book, The Future and Its Enemies, which really explored the growing contrast in society between different schools of thought about technology. Not schools of thought that were left or right, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, but had different points of view. And the sort of lens that she brought out in that book and in her subsequent works really help explore technology and society in unique ways. And we're going to talk about that in the context of her new book, The Fabric of Civilization, today. With that, we're going to show a short video about the book, and then we'll have the discussion. Let's cue the video.
I'm Virginia Postrel, the author of The Fabric of Civilization. My book is about one of humanity's most important and influential technologies: textiles. The word textiles comes from the Indo-European root tex, which means to weave. It's the same root that gives us the word technology. Textiles are such an old technology that we rarely think about them. They hide in plain sight. From the moment we are born, we are surrounded by cloth. We sleep among textiles, walk on them, wash, and dry with them. Textiles protect us from the elements. They carry our stuff. They help us celebrate. Textiles are everywhere. Textiles go to war. They keep us safe. And bandage wounds. They provide comfort and joy. The story of textiles is older than history and younger than tomorrow. It stretches back to cave dwellers twisting plant fibers into string, and forward to scientists embedding threads with computer chips. It is the story of human ingenuity in all its manifestations: artistic and technical, economic and cultural. The pursuit of cloth gave us germ theory. It led to the belt drive and the chemical industry. It built factories and finance. Textile traders spread the alphabet and Arabic numbers, literacy, and bookkeeping. They funded the Italian Renaissance and the Mughal Empire, the David and the Taj Mahal. The story of textiles is a story of commerce and culture, a story of peaceful trade and savage wars. The story of textiles is a human story. It's a story made by women and by men, by famous leaders and forgotten peasants. It's a story of art and science, of economics and religion. It's a global story set in every time and place. It is humanity's story. It is our story. Please join me in exploring the fabric of civilization, how textiles made the world.
Right? That gives you a sense of the real sweep of this incredible work. And now I'm happy to welcome on Virginia to come have the conversation.
It's great to be with you.
Hey, Virginia. And to everybody watching, quick note that you can ask questions, leave comments, and if you do so, you'll be entered in a raffle to get a free copy of the book, which I really do recommend checking out, along with Virginia's other amazing works. I mean, to start out with, Virginia, that video gives us a real sense of the sweep of history you're talking about. And, I think it's worth maybe beginning to unpack, you're talking about civilization. There's also this line, I think, in the innovators chapter late in the book, say, change textiles, change the world. And you're talking about these really big concepts, but it's not sort of some far off entity. Everybody can be a part of this. Everybody has a role. So can you unpack sort of what you mean by civilization there? What are you getting at?
Right. Well, civilization is a fraught word because it's often used in a very pejorative or judgmental way. There's civilization versus barbarism or uncivilized behavior, that sort of thing. I'm not using it in that sense. I'm using it in a more neutral sense. And I really like the definition that comes from a book that was published in 1934 by Mordecai Kaplan called Judaism as a Civilization. And he defined it as the accumulation of knowledge, skills, tools, arts, literatures, laws, religions, and philosophies, which stands between man and external nature, and which serves as a bulwark against the hostility of forces that would otherwise destroy him. And I think when you unpack that, basically you get two critical ideas. The first is that civilization is a survival tool. It's all the things that we develop that help us survive, flourish, protect ourselves against nature, and also, in many cases, against other human beings. And the other is that it's cumulative. And so civilization is something that exists in time. And a civilization can exist for a long time and encompass many different cultures. Culture is a sort of a smaller, more time bound, more geography bound sort of concept. And so, for example, if you look at Western Europe in 1980 versus 1480, that's a continuous civilization, but the Christendom of 1480 is very, very different from what you found in 1980 in Western Europe. I specifically picked that to avoid the whole communism versus, but how, and I think today, for the first time in history, we have a truly global civilization to which all the many cultures of humanity contribute. And that's unprecedented. And it's really only in the last couple of decades that that's truly happened.
Yeah. And, I think when you stop and think about it, of course, fabric, core to our lives. You mentioned in the video of swaddling a baby. But there are so many things in the book that are surprising. First for me was looking at Vikings and sails, that Vikings to create the boats far easier than creating the sails, the masts. The sails that go on the mast and other sorts of stories around germ theory. I mean, looking at that civilizational scope, like what stood out to you? What was surprising to you about going on this journey of fabric?
Yeah, well, one thing that's surprising is there are lots of little things that are surprising. One of the things that surprised me is that indigo, which is the blue that we know best nowadays from blue jeans, it originally came from plants, and the chemical that makes indigo is in all different kinds of unrelated plants, and it's very complicated to turn it into something that you can color cloth with, and yet people figured this out all around the world using different plants. They figured it out in in India, hence the name
Mm-hmm.
indigo. They figured it out using woad in Europe. They figured it out in Africa, in different parts of Asia, like Southeast Asia and Japan. It was this sort of universal blue dye from totally different plants and different versions of the processes, because of course, until relatively recently in history, people didn't have any idea what was going on at a chemical level. It was just how far can you get with trial and error. But our earliest indigo dyed cloth is from Peru, and it's 6,200 years old. And so you find, and my earlier book, The Substance of Style, you find this phenomenon, which I explore in that book, which is that people aren't content with just function. I mean, cloth
Mm-hmm.
obviously has a lot of important functional properties, but people were making striped cloth 6,200 years ago in Peru using blue dye, using native sort of tannish cotton, brown cotton, and using a white milkweed plant. And we have this little scrap that's been carbon dated 6,200 years ago. That sort of thing is just fascinating to me.
Yeah. And you're talking about today, sort of a global civilization, which sometimes we feel more fragmented than ever, sometimes more connected than ever before. But your book sort of takes us on a journey of that connection, from the story of sales and fabric's role in commerce. And I think part of also a shift in many ways from scarcity to abundance, or at least
that's a big part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that, to sort of connect the dots with being here at Google, that's a big thing we think about with digital technology. Of that's, you turn something into bits, it can be replicated, copied, made broadly available. Are there lessons from sort of the story of fabric becoming more abundant and, sort of more variegation, more varieties? What lessons or insights from that might we bring to technology today? Not necessarily digital, but otherwise, although you do talk about how digital and the physical come together as the book goes along.
Well, I think you've touched on one of the big themes, which is this shift from scarcity to abundance. Throughout most of human history, cloth was scarce. Everything was scarce. Food was scarce. And it's only with the Industrial Revolution, which made thread or yarn for making cloth available widely, and then later power looms and then chemical dyes and all these things that made cloth abundant, that cloth becomes abundant. And today, when you talk to people who are in the industry, the problems that they are grappling with, yes, they're still trying to get costs down. They're still trying to, and increasing productivity as part of that. But a lot of the problems are the problems of abundance. They are, what do we do with all these discarded clothes? What do we do? Dyes, as I talk about in that chapter, dyes have always been messy. They've always been polluting. They've always been stinky. They've always had negative side effects. But the problems that we have today are not because they're chemicals. They were always chemicals. It's the quantity. It's the scale. And we see similar, and those are great. My view is those are the problems you want to have. That doesn't make them any less problems. You still have to try to attack them, but those are much better than the problems of scarcity. And the same things are happening with information and with, it's the easiest time in human history to get published or produce songs or videos or market products to consumers. And yet it's the hardest time ever to get an audience. So that kind of super competitive thing is something that also has happened in fabric, so that you go from a world in which it's very scarce and costly to a world in which it's so common that we worry about disposal problems.
Yeah. I want to come back to that sort of the problems of abundance in a second. But I mean, I think the other thing, we see certainly in technology is where abundance is created, something else becomes scarce, and that becomes the new source of value.
Yeah.
And I mean, that was true in textiles, right? I mean, it seems like there are interesting lessons there. Maybe if you can share, how did that happen along the journey of fabric?
Yeah. Well, there are different versions of it. So let's talk about the big leap, because the spinning is a huge advance throughout most of human history. All around the world, women spent their lives spinning because it took huge amounts of time to make enough yarn to make anything. So if you take, for example, the cotton yarn that it takes to weave the denim for a pair of jeans, that's about 6 miles of cotton thread. And before the Industrial Revolution, Indian spinners using the charkha, who were the best and fastest in the world at spinning cotton, would have taken about an Indian spinner would have taken about 100 hours to spin that much thread for that single pair of jeans or trousers, if you will. And that goes back to your thing about the Viking sail. It took longer to make the Viking sail than it took to make the Viking ship. And the equivalent of 385 8-hour days was the spinning process. I mean, and there were other processes. There's plucking or shearing the wool, there's cleaning the wool, there's weaving the wool, there's sewing those panels together, which is why you see those stripes on, if you want to make them intimidating, you dye them. But either way, you've got to sew them together. But because the sails rot, we tend not to think about that. So before the Industrial Revolution, thread was very scarce. That was the bottleneck. The bottleneck was getting enough yarn to make the fabric. Weaving or knitting was not the bottleneck. In the late 18th century, you get mechanized spinning developed, driven by water power originally, and then later by coal, steam power. That suddenly opens up a huge amount of textile productivity because you've released that bottleneck. And one of the immediate effects of that is that weavers who suddenly have a great supply, now they also, they're sitting pretty. They're sort of industrial aristocrats. These are people who are hand weaving cloth. They suddenly have enough supply and they make good money. And that lasts a generation. So they're like top of the, they're like, we're cool, we're great, we're, the best, we're the most important. And then suddenly power looms come in and they start to lose their jobs. And not only do they start to lose their jobs, they start to lose their jobs to machines plus teenage girls, which is really insulting. So this is where we get the Luddites. And nowadays, we use the term Luddite to mean people who have like an ideological opposition to technology. But the original Luddites were just people who didn't want to lose their jobs. They were perfectly all right when people were losing their jobs spinning a generation earlier because that benefited them. But then and there were protests against the spinning machines too. And there were later protests against the jacquard looms that made weaving, even hand weaving, faster. So you see this process, particularly on the labor side, where skills that used to be more in demand become less in demand. And one of the things that I think is important to remind people, especially people, at Google who are in the position of those weavers enjoying their golden heyday, is that like, you're not better than everybody. You just happen to have the skills that are scarce now. In 20 years, those might not be the skills that are scarce. And in the big picture, it's very hard to tell people who are confronted with that moment where once valuable skills become less valuable, that it's for the good of everybody to let that process proceed. But that was the critical decision that the British government, it's not just a single authority. Some of them were local, some of them were national, but they decided to let the Industrial Revolution and the power looms and all of these things proceed. And this leads to what Deirdre McCluskey, the economic historian, has called the Great Enrichment, which continues to this day, which is this increase in global living standards, something like 3,000% over time, which has never happened before in human history. So that, I think, is a really important lesson. And you also, I don't talk about this a lot. The book is actually more in The Power of Glamour, my previous book, but
Mhm.
you start to have, much more urbanization, the development of department stores, new forms of retailing, new forms of distribution that also come out of that development of more abundant cloth. Because then you need ways to sell this more abundant cloth. And
Yeah.
so one thing leads to another in ways that you don't necessarily anticipate when you start.
Yeah. And I want to come back to some of these issues around sort of waste and labor affects change of demand, or rather, you, as you said, sort of abundance can be a good problem to have. Doesn't mean there aren't problems and challenges to
Right.
then take on. I think to your point, certainly I strive to be humble in the face of them, because they're they're always coming. They always come about, and we have to take them seriously. Before talking about some of those trade-offs, actually, I want to sort of drill down onto one that you briefly mentioned. I mean, I think part of abundance meant that there was greater customization and diversity. People could have styles, so value could move to other parts of the ecosystem, retailers,
Right.
or brands. But brands is a way of talking about moving the value from this keeps me warm, this shirt keeps me warm, this coat keeps me warm and dry, to this shirt makes me look good or doesn't make me look bad. And that, I think that's a really interesting thing. And I will, just to keep it going, hold up The Substance of Style, you said, is an important book to me. I think early in digitization, there was this real debate around, or at least early in the internet's age, in that stage of digitization, about the tyranny of choice. That
Right.
abundance would have challenges because I'd have 50 million types of jeans to buy, and I wouldn't know which one, and that's actually worse. I think that is a real felt emotion, but you had a different take on it, certainly then. And I'm curious, sort of now where you are, 15, 17 years since you
Right.
wrote that book, 20 years since you wrote that book. How do what was your take then? How has it evolved, if at all, about, customization and the tyranny of choice?
Right. Well, I think in terms of the tyranny of choice, I think it's always been uh, sort of naive to think that the way we would deal with um, overwhelming information or overwhelming consumer choice would be to go through each person, each choice personally.
Mm-hmm.
This is what brands are for. This is what editors are for. This is what, uh, word of mouth recommendations are for. This
Right.
is what hashtags are for. I mean, things that you never even considered in 2003 when that book came out.
Yeah.
Instagram with hashtags. That was the furthest thing from the world at that time. So that what that abundance of choice does is it means that people can find the thing that's right for them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's easiest to understand this I think, in the context of clothing fit. You
Mm-hmm.
sometimes have this complaint that we don't have standardized sizes, that a size 10 in one brand is not the same as a size 10 in another. And, wouldn't it be good if we had all the proportions set? Well, that would mean that only one person in the United States who has those proportions, that would be the
Mm-hmm.
only person who could find a pair of jeans that fit.
Mm-hmm.
um, and so by having these weird divergences from a kind of general range of size, it allows more people to find their right proportions. Because even if you are of average height and average weight, which basically I am for an American woman, you still have weird proportions. So I got like a narrow back and short arms, but long legs and a small waist and big hips and, all these things. So you can have somebody who's my same height and weight and completely different shape. So that, and you can apply that to not just to clothing sizes, but to taste, to taste in both the aesthetic sense and
Mm-hmm.
even like the food sense, all different kinds of things. Now, what I didn't get in the early internet days, I always say one of the smartest articles I ever wrote and the dumbest article I ever wrote was a piece I wrote for Forbes ASAP in the early days of the internet. And it was about what later came to be called the long tail. And the idea was, we've all got something weird about us. And because of this abundant technology and these ways of finding each other, this was also in the very early days of search, we can find the other people like ourselves. And this is great. And all that is true. And that's why it was so brilliant article. But what I didn't anticipate was the negative side of that, which is that we can get self-reinforcing things where we don't necessarily pay attention to the people who are different from us, or if we do pay attention to them, we only pay attention to them in a negative sense, as opposed to in the physical world where they're your neighbors and you need to get along with them, or you see all the things you share with them, and the thing that you disagree with them is less important. So that was something that happened that I anticipated, but I didn't fully anticipate all the ramifications.
Yeah, I think not alone there. And I think on a similar wavelength, I think you brought up the book, The Long Tail, which was this idea of, we live with entertainment or style or many industries sort of hits driven. There's a few percentage of people who make a lot of money, get a lot of popularity, and then a long subset of people, that long tail that maybe a few people like, but generally can't be found because, when it was CDs, they couldn't be stocked on the shelves, right? There wasn't physical space. And I think the long tail people thought, those people now rise in prominence. Well, they'd be found now, but I think still to this day, and what we should have anticipated then is people also like having things in common too. Yeah. They like customization and they like commonality, right?
Right. So there's a book I wrote a column about ages ago. I forget when it came out, in the early 2000s, by UCLA political scientist Michael Tre, who it's a book called Rational Ritual, and it's very mathy. He's one of these mathy political scientists. But basically, what he's saying is there's certain things, and the Super Bowl was one example, that we like for the simple reason that everybody's paying attention to it at the same time, and that gives us a kind of a shared experience, and that has a value of its own.
Yeah. And that means there will still be things that are more popular or less, or there will be agglomeration or mass platforms.
But I don't think the long tail, whether it was Chris Anderson's version or my version or whatever, was ever saying that we wouldn't have certain focal points, certain things that would be very common. What it was saying is that we had entered an era where, instead of having mass media, where the only things that could get an audience were things that could get a huge audience, we could now have smaller customized things. And going back to the substance of style, one of the things that I talk about in that book is the difference between mass markets and large markets. So a mass market is something where you produce the same thing and you sell it to everybody. And that was the mid 20th century thing. And it was part of trying to get everybody to what I call not bad, and it affected not just goods and services, but also the way we thought about politics and economics and, what were the goals of policy. And in a large market, and here I drew on Adam Smith's idea in the Wealth of Nations. In a large market, you have enough people that you can support specialization. And so the original large markets were big cities, but now the whole globe, through internet commerce and stuff, is a large market. And so therefore you can make very specialized things. Now there's still issues of attention, and that prioritizes various forms of search, and it's good, but it could be better. Discovery. I mean, still with something like The Fabric of Civilization, my biggest problem in selling the book is not getting people to like it. It's simply getting people to know it exists.
Yeah.
And that's not just my problem, but that's a problem for all kinds of people selling all kinds of things in this world of abundance.
Yeah. So we talked about some of the amazing things and some of the challenges. I want to get a bit more to the challenges of, and bring it back to the fabric and that story. Talk about sort of waste and labor in a second. But first, this is less sort of a hard but interesting stories. You write about these sumptuary laws,
Oh, yeah.
fashion becoming a crime. I mean, this is sort of the dark side, I think, potentially, at least to some, of trying to deal with the harms or the potential harms. Can you talk? What were those sumptuary laws? Why did they come about? Yeah.
So a classic sumptuary law was a law like in Ming China, in certain parts of Europe, where people were told only people of a certain class can wear this type of garment or this type of textile. So if you were in China and you did anything in commerce, you were not allowed to wear silk, you or any member of your family, because in the Confucian, you might have a lot of money, but in the Confucian hierarchy, you were low down. And they were quite well developed in different dynasties, different rules. And similarly, there were things in various parts of Europe, but the one that interested me the most was what you found in the Italian city-states, because most places where there were sumptuary laws, same thing in Edo, Japan, the sumptuary laws were designed to keep rich people who were engaged in commerce in their place. So that just because you had money didn't mean you could dress like the aristocrats. But so why would there be sumptuary laws in, Renaissance Florence, which is run by merchants? Well, the reason seems to have been that they were trying to create a conspiracy to rein in their household budgets, so that they would say, their wife or their daughter, because it's very gendered too, and their wife or their daughter would want some incredibly expensive new dress with the latest styles, and you could say, no, honey, we can't buy you that, it's illegal. But it didn't work very well. Like many attempts at cartels, there were always people who found a way around it. And so what ultimately happened in many of these places is that they developed fines for having these things, and then the fines developed into fees, and it became a way of raising money for the city, that if you if you wanted to have this fancy embroidered dress or whatever it might be, and it wasn't just for women, there were also like guys wore these super short pantaloons that look like mini skirt, these super short tunics that look like mini skirts. If you wanted to wear that, you had to pay a certain fee, and then you could do it without breaking the law. So it became this fiscal mechanism, because it was almost impossible to stop, because people were so good at evading the law. And there's another kind of, it's not a sumptuary law, but there's another extreme example that I write about, which is the various bans on Indian cotton prints and other imported fabrics from India. The most extreme one of which was in France, which for 73 years treated cotton prints and cotton prints, so three things, basically the way the U.S. treats cocaine. So it was illegal to possess them, it was illegal to wear them, and it was very, very illegal to traffic in them, to the point that people could even be executed for being traffickers in its cotton prints. And that was all about protectionism. That was about the entrenched silk industry in particular objecting to the competition.
Yeah. And I think something sort of, you can see that in the history of other media or other goods and services too over time. And I think that, to your part about your points about the Luddites, that's what sort of can reinforces like, hey, let's let this innovation and competition happen. We don't want to make the same mistake again. On the other hand, I do want to come to, you mentioned these are stories of, quote, excess and cruelty, of savage wars, of, thinking about the labor that went into making the stuff, shipping it, sometimes conscripted or slave labor, really, tough things. And I think then one of the challenges is to say, so fair enough. The problem of abundance, as you said, is a good problem to have. But so what? What should we do about it? Like, great, we have it, but then how do we deal with these knock-on effects of labor issues or environmental waste or fill in the blank?
Yeah, so nowadays it's the most of the concerns have to do with the environment because that's where the problems of abundance are really problems of abundance as opposed to scarcity. That is, the
Hmm.
scale matters. The fact that people have fast fashion and they dispose of things matters. And so when you look at where the sort of cutting edge is in clothing and apparel, you find lots of people who are worried about those problems. The question is whether they can get consumers to care about them or
Hmm.
whether they can alternatively find ways of production that are just as productive, just as inexpensive, but have a lighter impact. And so I write about a number of different things. It's somewhat random because it was limited by travel time and who was
Hmm.
available. But and they range from I went to, of all things, a dye house in Los Angeles, which I never would have guessed there you could even
Hmm.
maintain a dye house in LA because as everybody in California has very strict regulations. And basically what you have there is process innovations, incremental, little by little. How do we use less water this year versus last year? How do we use less energy this year versus last year? How do we eliminate waste cloth? How do we use every inch? And it does go to the bottom line as well as making it have a positive environmental effect, which this was in 2019. I was doing the interviews. I was hearing this year
Hmm.
is the first year that people actually made buying decisions based on that.
Hmm.
Before that, it was like all well and good as long as everything was the same. Now, how has that changed over the past couple of very weird years? I don't know. But you also see in the innovators chapter, I talked to a lot of scientists who didn't start in textiles at all. And this is very different from what you see historically. They didn't start in textiles, but once they realized that their research could be applied in textiles, they got very excited because textiles are everywhere. And
Hmm.
so, therefore, you can have a big impact. If you're worried about the environmental effects, you can have a big impact there. If you're worried about, just getting your research out, you can have a big impact there. So that's something that is definitely out there, and people are thinking about new ways to produce textiles through synthetic biology, for example, new ways to dye textiles, lensing, which makes modal and lyocell, which are uh, cellulose fibers made from renewable plant sources. They are now experimenting with putting indigo in the fiber when it's extruded, so it's
Hmm.
always blue, and that was done partly for uh, to eliminate waste in the dyeing process, but it has a side effect of it allows you to knit with these yarns because it used to be, how the blue can rub off your blue jeans, whether
Sure.
deliberately for fashion or just accidentally because you're wearing them. Well, that has made it impossible to knit uh, uh, garments easily when they're dyed with indigo because the blue rubs off and it gets in the machines and it makes a big mess. And this allows you to get some of those lovely indigo effects in knitted garments. So that's a new thing, and that's not in the book. That's something I've written about since the book came out. So there's a lot of ferment over that. In terms of labor, I think you have to differentiate between slave labor, which is definitely part of the history of textiles, not only in the American South, obviously most famously, but I talk about how the Mongols would imprison and deport weavers from their conquered territories and bring them back. This is how Islam got into Uyghur country,
Mm.
and I have a video that goes
Yep.
into it in a little more detail about that. Was because the Mongols took people from Afghanistan to the kingdom of the Uyghurs, which at that time was Christians and Buddhists and animists. There weren't Muslims. So those were the original Muslims in the Uyghur territory. And of course, today it's an issue there again, and in two ways. One is in picking cotton, and the other is in factory work. So that is definitely a part of it. Now, the fact that poor people, whether they're mill girls in New England in the 19th century or people working in Vietnamese factories today, work for what we would consider low wages in textiles. That I think it's perfectly fine to worry about working conditions as such, but you have to realize it's also the first step on the ladder to a more prosperous future. And so far as there's not coercion, it can be really important. And today, people who are development economists worry that if current trends continue, that bottom step of the ladder may get cut off before, say, countries in Africa can use textile production and apparel production to go up.
Yeah, I mean, I think, jumping from that, I hear a couple things in what you're saying in terms of how do we deal with the problems of abundance. On that last one is sort of thinking about what is that floor that we want everybody to stand on, So there are some sorts of protections we think everybody should have. We need to be able to agree on them. Another thing you talk about is incentives. And those incentives can come from law, but they can come from consumers. If consumers demand sustainability, that's a signal. And then a key one, diversity. So you were talking about the thinkers who came from academia to come into commerce, but that seems like a thin line of thinking about how do we understand the shape of abundance that we're getting, who benefits from it and how and why. And only if you have a diverse range of thought can we really bring out those benefits to their fullest.
Yeah, I think, and that's one of the advantages of having, this early, somebody is trying to call me. A guy who knows about indigo is trying to call me. That's one of the great advantages we have of this sort of global civilization for the first time in history, is that we have people from, first of all, more minds, and the starting at the diversity of the individual, but more cultures, more educational systems, more production systems, more people taking the same technologies and improving them in different ways, all of that stuff. And this is one reason that it's unfortunate that we're starting to see breakdowns, particularly between China and the rest of the world, because that will hurt everybody.
Yeah, that is, trying to have what are these baseline protections so that people are not only not enslaved, but not in ruinous sweatshops. How do we do that in a way that keeps civilization, as you conceived of it at the beginning of this talk, together? It is the problem, or one of the problems of our time. Yeah. With that, I see we have a couple of audience questions coming through. So why don't I turn to them? Let's put the first one up on the screen. I can read it out. Right, this one comes from SW. Does a fabric being known with a culture or trend assist with cultural tolerance, or is it surpassed by the trend and use?
Well, I think it really depends on a lot of things. So one of the sad examples is, happy and then sad. During the 19th century, the U.S. was the great weaver of silk cloth. But the U.S. doesn't produce silk. People had tried, but there was no place in the U.S. that was good for silk. And the silk thread that was made into cloth, finished in the cloth, came from Japan. And this was an incredibly productive cooperative venture from the late 19th century to the 1930s, because the Japanese, when they opened their country to the world, they already had a very produced, well-functioning silk industry, but they then took on board genetic science, as it was known at that time, and temperature controls and other things, and they improved, and they got really good new hybrids of silk worms, and those were perfect for using with the power looms in places like Paterson, New Jersey. And so there was this tremendous cooperation, and silk was very much associated with the East, but it also was something that became something that, a middle-class American woman would have a silk dress, maybe not a whole wardrobe of them, but then, of course, what happens in the 1930s is you see the divergence and the rise of militant nationalism in Japan, the rise of sort of a more xenophobic U.S. and protectionism, and that splinters. So, that's the fact that you have cooperation doesn't mean that you always stay friendly. And certainly there are other examples where, the mere fact that people take a style from some other place does not mean they import that entire culture. Um, but I think, like food, the fact that we can understand these things, they are universally human, can lead to a greater cultural appreciation of other places, other ways of life, of the ingenuity that you find everywhere.
Why don't we put the thanks, SW, for that question. Let's put the next on the screen from Dino Wang, who asks, abundance of clothes is increasing over time from Forever 21 fast fashion to Shein faster fashion, with corresponding increase in clothes waste, etc. Do you see a conclusion to this trend? Does it terminate somewhere or does it go on to infinity?
Well, nothing goes on to infinity. So yes, it will eventually conclude. But this is a question that I get whenever I talk to people who are in the fashion and apparel businesses, because a lot of them are thinking about this, or to students, fashion students, because it does seem unsustainable in some sense. On the other hand, these factories are incredibly productive, and so I think that it will require a change in fashion. That is, it will require that people feel they are more fashionable and more rewarded for wearing better made, more long lasting, potentially remixing secondhand things for longer. What you have right now is you have a lot of particularly young people, who, if you're in high school or whatever, and this happens all around the world too, what gets you status is never wearing the same thing twice. And as long as that's the source of status, you're going to see these companies selling into that sort of status. It's only if that becomes a marker of lower status, and this can happen. It's happened before. Um, it, that connoisseurship becomes more rewarded. This sort of thing, or the ability to remix things in a clever and interesting way, as opposed to just substituting something new all the time. But it really is a cultural question. It's not so much an economic question, because one of the sort of moral of the consumers chapter in my book is consumers want what they want, and that drives everything else. And if people will do horrific things like enslave people and transport people thousands of miles across deserts to get the textiles they want, they certainly will buy things and throw them away. You need to change people's incentives. You need to change where they derive status.
Yeah. And in some ways, I guess what you're saying in answering the question is also, we need to set some limits. So yes, abundance is a good problem to have, but also there are some limits where if we don't have our better angels propped up, that's what I hear in the end.
And when you say we, it's hard because culture is a bottom-up thing. Culture is an emergent order. Yes. What constitutes status is not something that you and I can sit here and declare. No. That if you are in the 10th grade, you're going to be low status if you don't recycle your clothes. We have no control over what 10th graders think, especially if we say if you're in the 10th grade in China or whatever. So these ideas are out there in the world, and I think they will play a role. In the meantime, the people who are focused more on the technological and production side try to think of ways that the production processes can be less wasteful, where they can cut inventories, where they can even potentially recycle used cloth into new cloth, those sorts of things. But ultimately, the consumer decides.
Let's take the next question here from Far. Far Nesbeth, can you speak to the phenomenon of history repeating itself, with fashion trends making reappearance every couple of decades? Is it mere nostalgia? That's a great question.
That is a great question. I tend to think that it's not just nostalgia, because the people who are, for example, I go in the stores and I see that they have like prairie dresses that remind me of the 1970s. I mean, there's a lot of different styles at once now, and I don't think the people buying those were around in the 1970s. I'm not even sure their mothers were around in the 1970s. So it's partly a nostalgia, but it's also that the eye gets tired of things. So you see something, and you can see this in non-economic thing. I mean, it's been analyzed in, for example, with baby names. I mean, something that seems really trendy then gets tired, then you want something new, then eventually the thing that was old-fashioned becomes cool and new, and everybody's naming their daughter Olivia, and now, no, you don't want an Olivia. That's, that means you're a specific age, and we're going to go on to something else. And that same cycle happens in fashion, and so when things come back, they don't come back in an identical form to what they were before, but the eye is looking for something new. And of course, fashion designers who are, they're out there in a highly competitive industry, figuring things out, throwing things out there, trying to see what sticks. They do know about the history of fashion, many of them. And they may, an individual fashion designer may be very inspired by something from the past, either by its formal properties or by some association. But that doesn't necessarily mean the buyers are.
Yeah, I think, it's so interesting, especially as we look at the space around digital goods. And we can't have a talk these days on the internet without something about blockchain or non-fungible NFTs and new artists. Right. And
yes, to your point, cloth as currency. There's a section for you people who love crypto to read that section in my book.
To your point, people want what they want of sort of art and aesthetic value is emergent, and you can't tie to simply this keeps me warm. And that will always be ever changing. And the question is then, how do we actually give space where that's empowering to everyone and not just to some? Where, sure, nostalgia, fine, or remix, fine, but let's have it in a way that is empowering, equitable, inclusive. And I think you take us on a journey of some really dark stories in that way, but some ways where when you end, as we end, look at the innovators chapter. I mean, some of the stories there of what people are making next, it's not just about aesthetics. It's like, it doesn't hold, you sweat and it doesn't hold the water or the scent.
Right.
And
yeah. I mean, that's the frontier. In addition to the environmental stuff we've talked about, it's these functional fabrics. And that's been the case for 20 years. It doesn't get a lot of attention because people tend to be, industry specialists. But if you look at what a workout shirt is like today versus 20, 30 years ago, it's night and day. And a lot of that has been by changing the shapes of polymer fibers, that sort of thing. And synthetic biology promises that it may be even greater. There may be greater possibilities down the road there. Yeah. So it's
with that sort of maybe to close on this question, you mentioned earlier, things we got wrong, things we get wrong, things we get right, things that are in between from, past things you've written about the long tail and such. When you think about this book, which is such a long sweep of history and then looks ahead, what are the things that you're most curious about looking ahead, or that you're most sort of uncertain about in that way of, I don't know how this is going to turn out?
Well, I'm definitely curious and uncertain about what will turn out with the various technologies that are being worked on today, particularly synthetic biology, which is basically, manipulating the genetics of yeast and other microorganisms so that they secrete things that can be polymers that can be turned into fibers and eventually into cloth. That seems very promising, but it's not yet commercialized. And so we'll see. The other thing that is more of a cultural question is, going through this history and studying all of these things from all around the world, I became acutely aware of just how innovative and intelligent and creative human beings are in many different cultures, and have been for a long time. And I see that as the common heritage of humanity.
Mhm.
I and I would like to think that we can get to a point where we can all recognize that and see our human commonalities as opposed to the things that divide us, even in the case of really terrible history, that we can all accept that terrible history is also part of the common. I mean, I emphasize the positive because that's kind of like my thing.
Mhm.
Human beings are so smart, they're so creative, they're also such nasty bastards to each other. That is also
Yes.
part of it. And, it's not a simple morality tale. It's
Yeah.
not doesn't have a Hollywood ending. It's complicated. But I think that it gives you a great appreciation of people who are very different from who you are today, as
Mhm.
well as the great thing about history is you see how much is the same and how much is different. And I think being able to hold those two ideas in our heads is very important.
That's right. More important than ever, as we have become a more open, interconnected global civilization,
Right.
and as we see that fragment and we get friction along a number of different layers, and with still lack of equity and diversity in various
Right.
ways.
Right.
Those challenges, if we're lucky, they get better, although they never end. And with that,
No,
it's so
that's right.
great to. Sorry, go ahead.
I just said that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, and with that, we're so lucky to have you as a teacher looking at that span of history and then helping us look ahead. Thank you again, Virginia, for taking the time today with Authors at Google, and looking forward to what next work you tackle, which next sweep of history. Thank you again.
Thank you.